Wyoming Territory, 1885. The dust was a constant companion, a second skin. It swirled in golden phantoms across the cracked earth, settled in the creases of a man's boots, and painted the horizon in a perpetual haze of ochre and pale blue. For Elias Thorne, the dust was just another part of the silence. His ranch, nestled in a valley that cupped the last reliable spring for 50 miles, was a kingdom of solitude. He had carved it from the wilderness with his own 2 hands, and its silence was a fortress he had built around his heart. From the porch of his sparsely furnished cabin, he watched the sun bleed across the western peaks, setting the vast, empty sky on fire. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine from the high country and the dry, earthy smell of the plains. He was a man made of the same stark elements as the land itself, weathered, quiet, and unyielding. His hands, calloused and strong, rested on the worn wood of the porch railing. They had built fences, broken horses, and buried everything he had ever loved. He rarely thought of that anymore. Thinking was a weakness, a crack in the wall where memory could seep in like a slow poison. His life was a rhythm of hard work, dictated by the sun and the seasons. He rose before dawn, the chill air a sharp slap to the senses, and worked until the last light faded, his muscles aching with a satisfying burn that left no room for other, deeper aches. His only regular human contact was Martha, the widow from town who came twice a week to clean and cook, her presence a quiet, unobtrusive hum in the background of his life. She knew not to pry, not to ask about the 2 small, unmarked stones that lay beneath the lone cottonwood tree near the creek. She understood that some griefs were too heavy for words. Elias believed in the simple, brutal truth of the frontier. A man survived alone. Attachments were liabilities, anchors that could drag you under in a land that offered no quarter. Love, he had learned in the cruelest way possible, was a fragile bloom in a world of stone and thorn. It was a lesson written in blood and fever, a memory that stalked the edges of his sleep. He had built his world on the foundation of that loss, a monument to the certainty that to care for someone was to invite devastation. He finished his coffee, the last of the warmth doing little to penetrate the chill that lived inside him. He stood, his tall frame a stark silhouette against the fading light. It was time to check the north fence line. Rustlers had been getting bolder in the territory, and his spring made his land a tempting prize for men with more greed than sense, like Silas Blackwood, whose sprawling cattle empire was always thirsty for more. Elias was not a man who looked for trouble, but he was one who met it head-on. His rifle was always clean, his eye always steady. He was prepared for any threat he could see. Then, a sound cut through the evening stillness, thin and mournful. The whistle of the 4 o'clock train, arriving from the east. It was a familiar sound, a distant reminder of a world he had long since turned his back on. Usually, it was nothing more than a punctuation mark in the day's slow passage. But tonight, for some reason he could not name, the sound lingered in the air, a long, lonely cry that seemed to echo in the hollow spaces inside him. It felt like a premonition, a faint tremor in the bedrock of his solitude. He dismissed the feeling with a grunt. It was just a train. It meant nothing. He turned his back on the sound and walked toward the barn, the dust rising to meet his boots, unaware that the world he had so carefully constructed was about to be shattered like glass against stone. The train hissed to a stop, a great iron beast sighing steam into the dusty air of Redemption Gulch. Annalise Vogel stepped down onto the platform, her hand clutching the handle of her worn leather satchel. She felt the immediate, oppressive heat, so different from the humid summers of Philadelphia. The sun was a hammer, the dust a fine grit that coated her tongue. She pulled her bonnet tighter, trying to shield her face from the glare and the curious, assessing stares of the men loitering near the station house. Everything was a study in brown and gray. The weathered, unpainted wood of the buildings, the dirt of the single main street, the faded denim of the men's trousers. It was a world stripped of color, raw and exposed. Yet, beneath her travel weariness and the film of grime, a fragile tendril of hope unfurled within her. This was it, the place where she would build a new life, a life of purpose. She was an orphan, a woman of modest means and considerable education, and the advertisement for a schoolteacher in this remote corner of the Wyoming Territory had seemed like a sign from Providence itself, a chance to be useful, to belong somewhere. She scanned the small crowd, searching for the face of Mr. Abernathy, the head of the school board who had corresponded with her. His letters had been so welcoming, so full of promise about the town's eagerness for a proper school. But there was no one who looked like the kind, elderly gentleman she had pictured. There were only rough-looking cowboys, a few tired-looking women in calico dresses, and the harried station master shouting at a boy to unload the freight. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Elias Thorne had finished his business at the general store, loading sacks of flour and salt into the back of his buckboard. He was about to climb up when he saw her. She stood out like a canary in a coal mine. Her dress, though simple by Eastern standards, was made of fine, dark blue wool, entirely unsuitable for the climate. Her hair, the color of warm honey, was coiled neatly beneath a prim bonnet. She held herself with a straight-backed dignity that seemed both admirable and tragically out of place. He saw the hopeful, searching look in her eyes, and he saw the moment it began to curdle into confusion and fear. He had seen women like her before, fresh off the train with stars in their eyes, only to be broken by the harsh reality of the frontier. They were delicate things, ill-suited for a life that demanded calluses on the hands and on the heart. He felt a flicker of something that might have been pity, an emotion he had long ago banished. He turned away, telling himself it was not his concern. He had his own fences to mend. Annalise approached the station master, a harried man with a sweat-stained shirt and a pencil behind his ear. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice clearer and more refined than any he had heard all day. "I am looking for Mr. Abernathy. I was told he would meet me." The station master squinted at her, then at the letter she held out. He grunted, not even bothering to read it. "Ain't no Abernathy on any school board here, miss. Fact is, we ain't got a school board. We ain't even got a school. Just a room in the back of the church where Parson Miller tries to teach the young uns their letters when he's sober." The words struck Annalise with the force of a physical blow. "But the letters. The position was advertised. I have the contract." Her voice trembled, the carefully constructed composure of her journey beginning to crumble. "Ma'am, I don't know what to tell you," the man said, his tone not unkind, but utterly final. "Looks like someone played a cruel trick on you. Happens sometimes. Luring folks out here on false pretenses." He shook his head and turned back to his ledger, the matter closed as far as he was concerned. The hope that had sustained her across 1,000 miles of rattling track evaporated, leaving a cold, terrifying void. She was alone, penniless, save for a few dollars meant to last until her first month's wages. Stranded in a town that did not want her, that did not even know it was supposed to exist for her. The stares of the men on the street now seemed less curious and more predatory. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Elias heard the exchange from across the street. A cruel trick. He felt a surge of cold anger at the casual malice of it. He saw the woman's shoulders slump, the proud line of her spine finally giving way to despair. He saw two rough-looking drovers detaching themselves from the saloon wall, their eyes fixed on her like coyotes on a wounded lamb. And something inside him, some long-dormant instinct, refused to let him turn away. He strode across the street, his long legs eating up the distance. The drovers saw him coming, noted the worn Colt revolver holstered low on his hip and the hard set of his jaw, and thought better of their intentions, melting back into the shadows of the saloon. He stopped in front of her, his large frame casting a sudden shadow over her. Annalise looked up, startled, into the grayest eyes she had ever seen. They were the color of a winter storm, and they held a deep, unshakable stillness. The man was tall and lean, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from the unforgiving landscape around them. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, rough baritone. "Looks like you're in some trouble." It was a statement, not a question. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. The sky was darkening, the wind picking up and whipping dust into their faces. A low rumble of thunder echoed from the mountains. A storm was coming. "The next train east ain't for 2 days," Elias stated, his gaze sweeping the street. "You can't stay here." He was thinking aloud, his practical mind assessing the problem. The hotel was little more than a brothel, and leaving her to the charity of the town was unthinkable. There was only one solution, and he hated it. It violated every rule he lived by. He let out a heavy sigh, a sound of profound reluctance. "My ranch is 5 miles out of town. I have a housekeeper, Martha. She'll see to you. You can stay there until the train comes." Annalise stared at him, caught between suspicion and a desperate, burgeoning relief. To go with a stranger, a hard-looking man with a gun at his hip, was a terrifying prospect. But to stay here, alone and vulnerable, was even worse. There was something in his eyes, beneath the hardness. It was not kindness, not exactly. It was a kind of weary honor. I have no money to pay you," she whispered, the admission of fresh humiliation. "I ain't asking for any," he said, his tone clipped. He gestured toward her trunk on the platform. "This all you got?" She nodded. Without another word, he hefted the heavy trunk as if it were a child's toy and carried it to his buckboard. He turned back to her, waiting. The decision was made for her. With a deep breath that tasted of dust and impending rain, she walked to the wagon. He put his hands on her waist to help her up, and his touch was like a brand through the fabric of her dress. It was firm, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through her entire body. Her foot slipped on the step, and she stumbled forward, falling against his chest. For a brief, breathless moment, she was pressed against the solid wall of him. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart, smell the scent of leather, dust, and clean sweat. His arms came around her instinctively to steady her, strong and sure. It was an accidental intimacy, over in a second, but it left an indelible mark. He set her upright on the seat, his face unreadable, and moved away to untie the horses, the space between them suddenly charged with a strange new tension. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as the wagon creaked into motion, leaving the false promises of Redemption Gulch behind them. The storm broke with a primal fury, turning the world outside the wagon into a churning chaos of wind and water. Rain fell in solid sheets, transforming the dusty track into a slick, treacherous river of mud. Annalise huddled under the inadequate oilcloth Elias had thrown over her, shivering as much from the sudden cold as from the shock of her circumstances. The man beside her seemed oblivious to the tempest. He handled the reins with an easy, focused competence, his eyes narrowed on the path ahead, his broad shoulders shielding her from the worst of the wind. They did not speak. The roar of the storm made conversation impossible, but Annalise suspected that even in perfect silence, this man would offer few words. He was a closed book, its cover made of worn leather, and its pages filled with a language she could not read. Yet his presence was a comfort. In his quiet capability, she found a small, solid rock to cling to in the flood of her despair. He had offered her shelter when he had no reason to, and that small act of decency was a flickering candle in the overwhelming darkness of her situation. When they finally arrived at the ranch, the cabin was a warm beacon of light against the gray, weeping sky. A stout, gray-haired woman holding a lantern stood in the doorway, her face etched with concern. This had to be Martha. As Elias helped Annalise down, his hand firm on her elbow, the woman's expression softened with a mixture of surprise and compassion. "Elias Thorne, what in heaven's name have you brought home?" Martha asked, her voice warm but direct as she ushered a drenched Annalise inside. "Trouble, looks like," Elias grumbled, shaking the rain from his hat. "She was stranded in town, deceived by some letter. She'll be staying until the next train." He delivered the facts with his usual economy, then turned to bring in Annalise's trunk, leaving the two women alone. The cabin was small but immaculately clean. A fire blazed in the stone hearth, casting a cheerful glow over the simple wooden furniture. The air smelled of wood smoke, baking bread, and lavender. It was the scent of a home. Annalise felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease for the first time all day. "You poor dear, you're soaked to the bone," Martha said, bustling forward. "Let's get you out of those wet things. There's a spare room." It's a spare room now. You can have a hot bath, and I'll find you something dry to wear. Later, wrapped in a thick wool robe that smelled faintly of cedar, Annalise sat by the fire, a steaming mug of tea warming her hands. Elias sat opposite her in a worn armchair, cleaning his rifle with methodical, deliberate movements. Martha served a simple but hearty stew, and for a while, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the drumming of rain on the roof, and the clink of spoons against pottery. The silence was different here than it had been in the wagon. It was a comfortable, domestic silence, but the space between her and Elias was still fraught with unspoken questions. "It was a cruel thing to do to you," Martha said, finally breaking the quiet. "To bring a young woman all this way with a lie." "I feel foolish," Annalise admitted, her voice low. "I wanted so much to believe it was real. A new start. Ain't nothing foolish about hope, child," Martha said gently. She shot a look at Elias, who remained focused on his task, his face a stony mask. "Some folks just forget how to have it." After the meal, Martha announced she was turning in, giving Annalise a reassuring pat on the shoulder before disappearing into a back room. Annalise and Elias were left alone in the flickering firelight. The intimacy of the setting felt both strange and profound. She was a complete stranger in this man's home, privy to its quiet, solitary rhythm. She watched his hands as he worked on the rifle. They were large and capable, scarred with the history of his life. She thought of how they had felt on her waist, steadying her. She needed to understand the man who had shown her such unexpected kindness, even if it was a gruff, reluctant sort of kindness. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice soft. He looked up, his gray eyes catching the firelight, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. "Thank you for what you did today. You did not have to help me. Couldn't leave you to the wolves," he said, his voice a low rumble. He went back to his work, a clear signal that the conversation was over. But Annalise was not so easily deterred. She had spent her life in pursuit of knowledge, and the greatest puzzle she had ever encountered was sitting right in front of her. "You live a very isolated life here," she observed, trying a different approach. "It's how I like it," he answered, his tone flat. "Why?" she pressed gently. "Most people seek out companionship. A town. A community." He stopped his work and finally met her gaze again, a flicker of something, annoyance or perhaps pain, in their depths. "Community is just a bigger word for complication. I have my work. It's enough." Annalise felt she was on the edge of something important. She leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest. Her next words were a quiet whisper, barely audible above the storm. "Tell me why you're really here, Mr. Thorne. In this valley. All alone. It's more than just a preference for quiet, isn't it?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and penetrating. It was too direct, too personal. She expected him to shut her down, to retreat back into his fortress of silence. For a long moment, he did. He set the rifle aside, his jaw tight. The silence stretched, thick with things unsaid. She thought she had made a terrible mistake, overstepped a boundary she hadn't even seen. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion he had clearly not allowed himself to feel in a long time. "I had a wife," he said, his eyes fixed on the flames. "Sarah, and a son, little Daniel." He said the names as if they were fragile, ancient things he had just excavated from his own heart. "We built this place together, had plans, a whole life mapped out." He paused, and Annalise held her breath, knowing she was bearing witness to the unlocking of a deeply buried grief. "Fever took them both," he continued, his voice devoid of inflection, a wasteland of sorrow. "In the space of a week. The doctor from town couldn't do a thing. I buried them myself. Under the cottonwood by the creek." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were not stormy now, but hollowed out, vast and empty. "This place is all I have left of them. I'm here because this is their grave. And staying alone, it's a way of keeping them safe. a way of promising I won't ever fail anyone like that again. The confession laid him bare. The solitary rancher, the stoic frontiersman, was a grieving husband and father, standing guard over the ghosts of his past. Annalise felt a wave of profound empathy wash over her, so powerful it almost brought her to tears. She understood now that his isolation was not a choice born of misanthropy, but a penance. "I am so sorry," she whispered, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. She thought of her own losses, the parents she had lost to consumption when she was just a girl. Her loneliness had been a constant ache, a part of her own quiet history. "I lost my parents when I was young," she shared, offering a piece of her own pain in return. "I know what it is to be left behind, to feel that the world has moved on and forgotten you." In that moment, a bridge formed between them, spanning the chasm of their different lives. It was a fragile structure, built of shared sorrow and mutual loss. He saw not a delicate Eastern lady, but a woman who understood the language of grief. She saw not a hard, unfeeling man, but a soul shattered by a love so great its absence had reshaped his entire world. He had expected her pity. Instead, he found a quiet, powerful understanding that asked for nothing in return. For the first time in 5 years, Elias Thorne did not feel entirely alone in his cabin, and the realization was as terrifying as it was comforting. The storm passed in the night, leaving the world washed clean and glistening under a pale morning sun. Annalise awoke to the smell of coffee and bacon and the sound of Martha humming in the kitchen. She dressed in her own clothes, now dry and pressed, and felt a measure of her composure return. The events of the previous day felt like a fever dream, especially the raw, unguarded confession Elias had offered in the firelight. When she entered the main room, he was already at the table, a cup of coffee held in his large hands. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, his eyes held a wary, guarded expression, as if he regretted the vulnerability he had shown her. He gave her a curt nod and returned his attention to his coffee. The walls were back up, but Annalise now knew what they were built to protect. "The road to town will be a sea of mud," Martha announced, placing a plate of eggs and bacon in front of Annalise. "You won't be going anywhere today, child. The train might not even get through." Annalise felt a strange mixture of dismay and relief. Her logical mind told her she needed to leave to figure out her next steps. But a deeper part of her, a part that had been starved for a sense of safety and belonging, was grateful for the reprieve. She spent the day helping Martha, finding a simple, satisfying rhythm in kneading dough, mending linens, and tending the small vegetable garden behind the cabin. She was surprised to find her hands, accustomed to books and ink, took to the work with a natural ease. She saw Elias only from a distance. He was out on the range, mending fences broken by the storm, a solitary figure moving with purpose against the vast landscape. Each time she glanced up and saw him, she felt that strange pull again, a recognition of the profound loneliness that mirrored her own. She began to see the strength in his solitude, not just the sadness. He was a man who endured. He had faced the worst life could offer and had not broken. He had simply reshaped himself around the emptiness. He, in turn, found his gaze drifting toward the cabin more often than he liked. He saw her laughing with Martha in the garden, her honey-colored hair coming loose from its pins and catching the sunlight. He saw her sitting on the porch in the afternoon, a book in her lap, her brow furrowed in concentration. She did not belong here, in his rough, Spartan world. She was a splash of vibrant color in his monochrome existence, and her presence was a constant, unsettling disruption to the quiet grief he had cultivated for so long. He told himself it was an intrusion, but it felt dangerously like light seeping through the cracks. He was beginning to see her resilience, the steel spine beneath the refined exterior. She wasn't complaining or lamenting her fate. She was making herself useful, adapting. She was not the fragile thing he had first assumed. That evening, a rider approached the ranch. Elias met him in the yard, his hand resting near his colt, his stance immediately wary. The man was one of Silas Blackwood's foremen, a burly man with a sneer permanently etched on his face. "Thorn," the man grunted. "Blackwood sent me. He heard you got some company." His eyes slid past Elias to where Annalise stood watching from the doorway, a speculative, unpleasant gleam in them. "My business is my own," Elias said, his voice flat and cold as river stone. "Mr. Blackwood, he's a hospitable man. He's always interested in new folks in the valley, especially pretty ones," the foreman continued, his tone deliberately provocative. "He's also still interested in buying this plot of land. The offer stands. Might be a good time to consider it. A man alone can have accidents." The threat was barely veiled. "Tell Blackwood my answer is the same as it's always been," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "This land is not for sale. Now get off it." The foreman held his gaze for a moment, then seemed to decide that pushing further was a bad idea. He spat on the ground, turned his horse, and rode away, leaving a trail of unease in his wake. Elias turned and saw Annalise in the doorway, her face pale. The brief, fragile peace of the day had been shattered. The dangers of this land were no longer an abstraction to her. "Who is Silas Blackwood?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. "A man who thinks the whole territory belongs to him," Elias explained, his jaw tight with anger. "He wants my spring. He's been trying to buy me out or run me off for years. And now, because I am here, he sees a new weakness," she surmised, her intelligence cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Elias didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. Her presence had complicated things. It had made him a target in a new and more vulnerable way. The realization settled in his gut like a cold stone. His fortress had been breached, not by her, but by his own act of bringing her into it. And now, the enemy was circling. He felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it startled him. It was an old, familiar feeling, one he had sworn never to experience again. The instinct to shield, to defend, to place himself between someone he cared for and the world's sharp edges. The thought that he was beginning to care for her was the most terrifying realization of all. The next day, Elias insisted on riding with Annalise to check a line of traps he had set by the creek. He told himself it was because Blackwood's men might be snooping around, but he knew it was more than that. He wanted her near. Martha packed them a lunch, her knowing smile making Elias scowl. The air by the creek was cool and smelled of damp earth and wild mint. Annalise, who had ridden horses as a girl in the Pennsylvania countryside, handled her mare with a quiet confidence that surprised him yet again. She asked him questions about the land, about the names of the wildflowers and the calls of the birds. Her curiosity was genuine, her appreciation for the harsh beauty of the landscape a balm to his own jaded view of it. He found himself talking more than he had in years, explaining the ways of the wilderness, sharing a knowledge that was as much a part of him as his own bones. As they rode through a thicket of aspen trees, their leaves trembling like golden coins in the breeze, two of Blackwood's men burst from the trees, whooping and firing their pistols into the air. Their intent was clear: to spook the horses, to cause an accident. Annalise's mare reared in terror, her eyes wide with panic. Annalise cried out, losing her grip on the reins as the horse bolted. Without a second's thought, Elias spurred his own horse, a powerful buckskin named Ghost, into a gallop. He flew past the two surprised cowhands, his focus entirely on Annalise. He could see her slipping from a saddle, her life hanging by a thread. The image of another woman he loved, lost to circumstances beyond his control, flashed through his mind, a jolt of pure, cold terror. He pushed Ghost harder, leaning low over the horse's neck. He drew alongside the runaway mare, reached out his arm, and circled Annalise's waist, pulling her from the saddle and onto his own horse in a single, fluid motion. He held her tight against his chest, his heart hammering against his ribs, as he brought Ghost to a controlled, rearing halt. He could feel her trembling in his arms, her face buried against his shirt. He turned to face Blackwood's men, who had stopped, their foolish prank having escalated into something far more dangerous. Elias's face was a mask of cold fury. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was more menacing than any weapon. "Ride back to your boss," he said, his voice lethally quiet. "You tell him this is his last warning. The next time any of you come near my land, or near her, I will not be so restrained." The men, unnerved by his calm intensity, exchanged a nervous glance, then wheeled their horses and galloped away. Elias's attention returned to the woman in his arms. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. Annalise lifted her head. Her bonnet was gone. Her hair was a mess of tangled honey strands, but her eyes were clear. She was shaken, but she was not hysterical. "I am now," she said softly. She was still pressed against him, his arm a band of steel around her. She was acutely aware of his strength, of the solid, reassuring beat of his heart beneath her ear. In that moment, he was not just her rescuer. He was her anchor. He gently let her go, a sudden awkwardness descending between them. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind the raw, undeniable truth of what had just happened. He had risked his life to save her without hesitation. He had acted on pure, protective instinct. "We should go back," he said, his voice gruff as he tried to rebuild his walls. But it was too late. Annalise had seen past them again. She had felt the fierce, desperate strength in his arms, and had seen the naked fear in his eyes when he thought she was going to fall. It was the look of a man terrified of losing something precious, something he hadn't even admitted to himself that he had. The rescue had solidified something between them, an unspoken bond forged in a moment of shared danger. As they rode slowly back to the cabin, sharing a horse, the physical closeness was a constant, warm reminder of the emotional one that was growing, whether he was ready to accept it or not. The incident by the creek changed the atmosphere at the ranch. The threat from Silas Blackwood was no longer a distant possibility. It was a palpable presence, coiled like a snake in the tall grass. Elias became more watchful, his rifle never far from his hand. But the greater change was within him. The act of saving Annalise had broken something loose, a torrent of feeling he had kept dammed up for 5 years. He found himself watching her constantly, memorizing the way she smiled at Martha, the determined set of her jaw when she mastered a new chore, the thoughtful expression in her eyes when she read by the fire. This growing attachment terrified him. It was a betrayal of his grief, a violation of the promise he had made to himself on the day he filled in his family's graves. To love again was to risk another apocalypse of the heart. To protect Annalise, truly protect her, meant he had to get her away from him, away from the danger her presence on his land had created. The only way to save her was to send her away. The logic was cold, brutal, and, in his mind, inescapable. He waited until the next morning, when the buckboard was loaded with supplies for his monthly trip to the town of Laramie, a much larger settlement 2 days' ride away. He found her scattering feed for the chickens, the early morning light turning her hair to spun gold. "The road is clear," he said without preamble. "I'm heading to Laramie. There's a stagecoach that leaves from there every morning. It could take you back east. I'll give you the money for the fare." Annalise stopped, the grain falling from her still hands. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of shock and hurt. "You want me to leave?" she said, her voice flat. It was not a question. "It's not safe for you here," he said, his voice hard. He forced himself to be cruel, believing it was a kindness. "Blackwood sees you as a lever to use against me. As long as you're here, you're in danger. I brought you into this, and I will get you out of it. So you're just going to put me on a stagecoach and send me away?" she asked, a spark of anger flashing in her eyes. "Like a piece of luggage that has become inconvenient." "This is not about convenience," he ground out, frustrated by her refusal to see his logic. "This is about your life. You don't belong here, Annalise. You belong in a place with schools and libraries and people who know how to behave. Not here, in the middle of a range war. And you get to decide that for me?" she challenged, her voice rising. "You get to decide where I belong? I was building a life here. Or at least, I was trying to. I was happy." "Happy," he scoffed, the sound harsh. "Doing chores? Living in a borrowed room? Waiting for the next time Blackwood's thugs decide to cause trouble? That's not a life for you. The sting of his words was sharp. He was throwing her own resilience back in her face, framing her strength as a foolish liability. "What I have found here is more of a home than I have had in a very long time," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "With you. With Martha. I thought we were becoming—" She trailed off, unable to say the word friends or family. "We are nothing," Elias said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He had to make the cut clean. He had to make her want to leave. "You are a woman I helped out of a bad situation. That's all. The debt is paid. It's time for you to go back to your own world." Each word was a hammer blow to her heart. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign that he did not mean it, any flicker of the connection she had felt growing between them. But all she saw was a cold, impenetrable mask. The man who had shared his deepest grief, who had held her in his arms and saved her life, was gone. In his place was a stranger, a hard man determined to push her away. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of anger and profound hurt. "Fine," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If that is what you want, Mr. Thorne, I will pack my things." She turned and walked back to the cabin, her back ramrod straight, refusing to let him see her cry. Elias stood frozen, watching her go. The pain in his chest was a physical thing, a sharp, twisting agony. He had done it. He had protected her by driving a wedge between them so deep it could never be crossed. He had saved her from Blackwood by breaking her heart, and his own in the process. It was the right thing to do. He repeated the words to himself over and over, but they offered no comfort. It felt like burying his heart all over again. Annalise packed her trunk with numb, mechanical movements. Each folded dress, each carefully placed book felt like a stone being laid on the grave of the future she had briefly, foolishly, allowed herself to imagine. She worked through the morning, ignoring Martha's worried glances and gentle questions. The pain of Elias's rejection was a cold, hard knot in her chest. He had made it clear she was a burden, a complication he was eager to be rid of. The kindness she had seen, the vulnerability he had shared, had it all been a lie? Or was she so starved for connection that she had imagined it all? By late afternoon, she was ready. Her trunk stood by the door, a final, sad testament to her failed journey. She looked out the window and saw Elias on the porch, staring out at the valley, his back to the house. He was a statue of resolute loneliness. The sight of him, so determined in his isolation, ignited a fresh wave of anger in her. He had no right to make this decision for her. He had no right to assume she was too weak to face the dangers of this life alongside him. Suddenly, the sound of hoofbeats broke the afternoon quiet. It was not one rider, but several coming fast. Elias straightened instantly, his hand dropping to his gun. Annalise's heart leaped in her throat. It was Blackwood. "Inside, bolt the door," Elias yelled, his voice cracking like a whip. He didn't wait for her to obey. Kicking the door shut himself as the first gunshot splintered the wood of the porch railing. Martha screamed from the kitchen, and Elias shoved both women toward the back of the cabin. "Stay down." The attack was swift and brutal. Gunshots erupted from 3 sides of the house, shattering windows and peppering the log walls. It was not a warning this time. It was an assault meant to kill or burn them out. Silas Blackwood and a half-dozen of his men had laid siege to the ranch. Elias moved with a deadly calm, a man in his element. He grabbed his Winchester from its rack above the mantelpiece and took up a position by a window, returning fire with methodical precision. Each shot was aimed, each movement economical. This was his fortress, and he would defend it to the last. Annalise, huddled on the floor beside a terrified Martha, refused to be a passive victim. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her anger was a fire in her veins. This was happening because of her. But Elias was wrong. She was not a weakness. She would prove it. "Martha, is there another rifle?" she asked, her voice tight but clear over the din of gunfire. Martha, her face ashen, pointed a trembling finger toward a heavy wooden chest. his father's old sharps. But child, you don't know how to. You can teach me to load it, Annalise interrupted, crawling toward the chest. Elias needs help. While Elias kept the attackers pinned down, Annalise dragged the heavy rifle and a box of cartridges back to where Martha was hiding. Under the old woman's frantic instructions, she learned the mechanics of the weapon, her hands surprisingly steady. She was a schoolteacher. She learned things. This was just another, more terrifying lesson. I can't hit anything from in here, she said, looking around the besieged room. We need a diversion. Elias, grunting as a bullet grazed his shoulder, glanced back at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and astonishment. Annalise, get down. That's an order. You lost the right to give me orders when you decided to send me away. She shot back, her spirit defiant even in the face of death. She saw her chance. One of the attackers was trying to sneak around to the back of the house, likely with oil and a match. The back door, leading from a small kitchen, was their blind spot. While Elias was occupied with the men in the front, this one could end them all. Elias the back, she screamed. He cursed, realizing his mistake, but he was pinned down. He couldn't move without exposing himself to a fatal crossfire. I can't get to him. Annalise made a decision. It was reckless, it was terrifying, but it was necessary. She grabbed the heaviest cast-iron skillet from the hearth. Keep them busy, she said, her voice low and determined. She crawled into the kitchen, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. She pressed herself against the wall beside the back door, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure the man outside could hear it. She could hear his footsteps, the scrape of boots on gravel. She heard the telltale glug of kerosene being splashed against the logs. He was going to burn them alive. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she wrenched the door open and swung the heavy skillet with all her might. The man, a lanky cowhand with a cruel face, looked up in stunned surprise just as the iron connected with the side of his head. He crumpled to the ground without a sound, the can of kerosene rolling from his grasp. At that moment, another of Blackwood's men, seeing the back door open, charged forward. Elias saw him from the window and yelled her name, a cry of pure anguish. He fired, but his angle was bad. The shot went wide. The man was almost upon her, his pistol raised. Annalise didn't have time to think. She scrambled for the dropped Sharp's rifle she had left by the door. She didn't have time to aim properly. She just pointed the heavy barrel in the man's direction and pulled the trigger. The kickback slammed her back against the doorframe, her shoulders screaming in protest, but the rifle roared. The man staggered back, clutching his leg, and fell. The momentary lull was all Elias needed. He burst from the front door, his Winchester blazing, a figure of righteous fury. The remaining attackers, their nerve broken by the ferocity of the defense and the loss of their comrades, turned and fled, Blackwood among them. Silence descended, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded man in the yard and the ragged sound of their own breathing. The fight was over. Elias rushed to Annalise, his face a mask of terror and relief. He saw the skillet, the unconscious man, the rifle still clutched in her hands. He looked at her, at this woman he had called delicate, this woman he had tried to send away for her own safety, and he saw a warrior. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her, as if she might break. "I'm fine," she said, her voice trembling now that the danger had passed. "You're bleeding." She pointed to his shoulder, where blood was seeping through his torn shirt. He barely glanced at it. All he could see was her. The terror of nearly losing her, of watching that man charge at her, had stripped away every last defense. His logic, his solitude, his carefully constructed reasons for pushing her away, they all turned to dust in the face of that heart-stopping fear. He had been a fool. His fortress of solitude hadn't kept him safe. It had been slowly killing him. Her presence in his life wasn't a danger. It was the only thing that had made him feel alive in 5 years. He reached out and gently took the heavy rifle from her hands, setting it aside. Then he framed her face with his palms, his thumbs stroking away the smudges of dirt and gunpowder on her cheeks. His gray eyes were no longer stormy or hollow, They were filled with a raw, desperate emotion that stole her breath. "Don't go," he whispered, his voice thick and ragged. "Annalise, please. Don't go." The words were a plea, a surrender. It was everything she had wanted to hear, spoken at the moment of greatest peril. "I was wrong," he continued, his gaze searching hers, desperate for her to understand. "Sending you away. It wasn't to protect you. It was to protect myself. From this. From feeling this. I love you. I think I started loving you the moment you fell into my arms on that train platform. Living alone isn't strength, it's a prison. And I don't want to be in it anymore. Not without you." Tears, hot and cleansing, finally streamed down Annalise's face. They were not tears of pain or fear, but of overwhelming relief. She leaned into his touch, her body finally succumbing to the tremors of a battle fought and won, both inside and out. "I love you too, Elias," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." He closed his eyes, a shudder running through his powerful frame, and then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate and hungry, a confirmation of life in the face of death, a claiming and a surrender all at once. It tasted of gunpowder, dust, and the undeniable promise of a new beginning, forged in the heart of the fire. In the aftermath of the attack, a new, quiet order settled over the ranch. Elias tied up the 2 wounded men and sent Martha into town with a buckboard to fetch the sheriff and a doctor. He and Annalise were left alone in the bullet-scarred cabin, the silence between them no longer one of distance, but of profound, shared intimacy. Annalise insisted on tending to his wound first. She gently cut away the torn fabric of his shirt, her touch light and careful as she cleaned the graze on his shoulder. Elias sat stoically, though it was not the sting of the antiseptic that made him flinch, but the gentle proximity of her, the scent of lavender and soap that clung to her even now. He watched her, her brow furrowed in concentration, and felt a wave of tenderness so powerful it almost buckled him. This woman, who had faced down armed men to defend his home, his life, was now tending to him with such care. His heart ached with the love he had so fiercely denied. "You were very brave," he said, his voice low and rough. "I was terrified," she confessed without looking up from her work. "But I was more afraid of losing you. And I was angry. You underestimated me, Elias Thorne." "I know," he admitted, the words of surrender. "I will never make that mistake again." When she was finished bandaging his shoulder, he stood and pulled her to her feet. He led her out of the cabin and toward the lone cottonwood tree by the creek. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, dappling the ground with light. Beneath the tree were the 2 small, weathered stones he had told her about. His past. He stood before them, his hand finding hers and lacing their fingers together. "This is Sarah," he said softly, nodding to one stone. "And this is Daniel." He paused, gathering his strength. "For 5 years, this was all I had. A place to grieve. I thought my life ended here, with them. I thought my heart was buried with them." He turned to face her, his gray eyes clear and filled with a solemn light. "Then you came. You walked into my silent world and filled it with life. You filled this house with warmth and laughter. You made me remember what it felt like to care. You made me want to build something again, instead of just guarding ruins. You didn't replace them, Annalise. You made a new space. You brought my heart back from the grave." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver ring. It was simple, elegant, with a tiny, intricately carved flower on it. "This was my grandmother's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She gave it to my mother, who gave it to me for the woman I would spend my life with. I gave it to Sarah once, but she gave it back to me before the end. She told me love was not a thing to be buried. She told me to find it again one day." He looked down at the ring, then back into Annalise's tear-filled eyes. "I never thought that day would come, but it has. It's here, with you." He got down on one knee, there on the sacred ground of his past, offering her his entire future. "Annalise Vogel, will you marry me? Will you build a new life with me? Right here." Annalise was weeping freely now, her heart so full it felt it might burst. "Yes," she breathed, the word of prayer. "Oh, yes, Elias. Yes." He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And to him, she was. He was no longer a man defined by his loss, but a man defined by the love he had found. By the time Sheriff Brody arrived with a posse, Blackwood's captured men had already confessed everything. The attack, the years of intimidation, the fraudulent letters sent to Annalise. It had all been part of Blackwood's desperate scheme to get Elias's land and water. The community, which had once viewed Elias as a reclusive, standoffish figure, was galvanized. The story of the siege and of the brave schoolteacher who had fought alongside him spread through Redemption Gulch like wildfire. Silas Blackwood was arrested in Laramie 2 days later, his empire of greed crumbling under the weight of his crimes. The townspeople, who had been cowed by his power for so long, rallied around Elias and Annalise. They showed up at the ranch in droves, not with gossip, but with hammers and lumber and sacks of fresh supplies. They helped repair the bullet holes, replace the broken windows, and offer their friendship. Elias, who had held himself apart for so long, found himself awkwardly accepting their help, shaking their hands, and sharing coffee on his porch. He was no longer just the solitary rancher in the valley. He was their neighbor, a man who had fought for his home. And Annalise was not the stranded Easterner. She was their hero, the woman who had brought him back to the world. A month later, they were married by Parson Miller in the small-town church, the entire population of Redemption Gulch in attendance. They celebrated afterwards with a feast and a barn dance at the ranch, the sound of laughter and fiddle music filling the valley that had once known only silence. Annalise, standing with Elias on their porch, watching their friends and neighbors celebrate their union, felt a profound sense of peace. She had come west seeking a position and a purpose. Instead, she had found a home, a community, and a love greater than any she had ever dared to imagine. 2 years later, the late afternoon sun cast long, gentle shadows across the valley. The Thorn Ranch was no longer a stark monument to solitude, but a thriving, vibrant homestead. A new wing had been added to the cabin, its fresh-cut pine smelling sweet in the warm air. The porch was wider, with 2 rocking chairs and a small cradle, currently empty, tucked in the corner. Where there had once been only dust and wild grass, there was now a sprawling garden, bursting with the colors of lavender, roses, and sunflowers, all planted and tended by Annalise. The scent of her flowers mingled with the smell of baking bread that drifted from the open kitchen window. Elias rode in from the north pasture, Ghost moving at a slow, easy walk. He was no longer the hard, solitary man who had first met the train from the east. The harsh lines on his face had softened, replaced by the quiet contentment of a man at peace. The haunted look in his eyes was gone, supplanted by a warm, steady light. He looked at his home, at the smoke curling from the chimney, and a slow smile touched his lips. He dismounted by the barn, which also showed signs of expansion, and saw Annalise standing by the creek, under the shade of the great cottonwood tree. She was not looking at the 2 small stones that still rested there, silent reminders of a grief that had been honored and integrated into their lives, not erased. Instead, she was watching their son, Daniel, a sturdy toddler with his mother's honey-colored hair and his father's serious gray eyes, who was chasing a butterfly through the tall grass. The name had been her idea, a way to honor the past while embracing the future. Elias walked toward them, his steps silent on the soft earth. Annalise heard him anyway. She turned, a welcoming smile lighting up her face. She was glowing, her dress swelling with the gentle curve of another child, due in the spring. He came to stand beside her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders and pulling her close. "Everything all right in the north pasture?" she asked, leaning her head against his chest. "Fences are strong. The herd is fat. The world is quiet," he answered, his voice a low, happy rumble. He watched his son stumble and fall, then pick himself up with a determined look, and his heart swelled. "Look at him. He's got your stubbornness." "And your strength," she countered softly. She looked up at him, her love for him a tangible thing in the warm afternoon air. Do you ever miss it? The silence. Elias considered the question. He thought of the years of profound, aching quiet, the emptiness of the cabin, the lonely meals, the nights filled with ghosts. He compared it to the sounds that now filled his world. The laughter of his son, the sound of his wife's voice reading a book aloud in the evenings, the friendly chatter of neighbors who now stopped by regularly. He bent his head and pressed a kiss to her temple. The silence was never peace, Annalise, he said, his voice full of a conviction born from years of sorrow and a few short years of immense joy. It was just the absence of life. This, he gestured to their son, to her, to the home they had built together. This is life. Everything I ever needed, everything I ever thought I lost forever, is right here. She slipped her hand into his, her fingers twining with his calloused ones, the silver ring he had given her warm against her skin. They stood together, watching their son, two solitary souls who had found their home not in a place, but in each other. The sun dipped below the peaks, painting the sky in strokes of rose and gold, and the first stars began to prick the deep velvet of the Wyoming night. A new, better silence settled over the valley, one filled not with emptiness, but with the quiet, unshakable promise of a shared future.